I'm thrilled to have all four of you on the stage. Some of you I've worked with for many years, and some part of MedTech Women for many years, and sponsors. But I'd love for you all to introduce yourselves. I'm Kristi Nakayama. I'm Senior Vice President of Global Business Development for Veranex's CRO and Consulting Services. Devon, to my left, would you like to go next?
Good afternoon. My name is Devon Bream. I'm the President and GM for GE Healthcare, our invasive cardiology division, and excited to be here for this panel. Thank you.
And I'm Virginia Giddings. I am Vice President of Exploration with Edwards Lifesciences. It's nice to be here today.
Good afternoon, everyone. Eric Schantz. I'm at Medtronic, Vice President in Corporate Development. Been in corporate development for about 12 years, covered most of our businesses the last 4 years on the cardiology side.
Doug Solomon from JP Morgan. I lead our medical technology practice within our healthcare investment banking group.
I'm so glad to see this turnout for this topic, because 2023 and leading into 2024, it hasn't been an easy time for M&A and strategic partnerships and raising funds. With that said, there are some, I was actually just at an FDA conference last week, MDMA up in Palo Alto, and there was a big portion of the conference dedicated to the importance of clinical evidence. And I know that has often been a major milestone for companies and partnerships and our large strategics and investors, and when and the right time to invest in companies. So Virginia, to you first. In terms of de-risking acquisitions or potential partnerships, how does Edwards weigh clinical as a major milestone to take the leap with a partnership or an acquisition?
Yeah, so clinical evidence is a biggie for, I feel like it is in medtech, and particularly with class 3 medical devices. But with Edwards, it's sort of always been a big area for us. For those of you not familiar with Edwards, we play in the structural heart space. We're a valve company and focused in that space. When you think about, I think the question is more about investing and how you think about clinical evidence in the context of investing. And there's probably a lot of people from startup companies here who are sort of wondering, like, at what point, what milestone should they hit to be invested in by different kinds of investors. And I will say this, that one of the things that's really critical for Edwards is that we want to lead in shaping the new fields and shaping structural heart. And to be able to do that, we're willing to go in very early. So when you go in early on investments, you wouldn't expect there to be clinical evidence. We love to see clinical data. At the end of the day, like, clinical data is what proves and demonstrates your technology. So being able to see that is really helpful. That said, sometimes we will, if we think a technology is really promising, we'll go in much earlier. We spend a lot of time really digging into the clinical evidence, and I'll say, like, every patient, when you're in an early stage with a new technology that's unproven, every patient is really precious, and being able to get all of the information that you can to really understand those individual patients. So even if you have a series of 10 patients, that can be quite helpful. One of the theme of this is what's, like, sort of changed or what's new. And I don't know that, I think clinical evidence has always been important, but probably in this, sort of more constrained investing environment, and with regulatory bars and reimbursement bars going up, that it's more important than ever. Just a few things to think about for the companies here is, like, really thinking through, what is the need that you're addressing with your technology, and then have you structured your clinical studies, the population, the outcomes to really address that need.
Thank you. Speaking of, it's always been important, but the changing landscape, Devon, in AI and ML, I know with GE, even FDA is learning as we go, or as they go, on what data requirements are needed and what the level of data sets, and then how do you include diversity. I mean, that's a whole nother conversation. But for GE, what is important when you're looking at companies and the data collection and in order to really vet where they are and what is needed?
Yeah, it's a
And
really
how
good
has
question.
that changed?
Yeah. Kristi, so I think I was sitting in this audience 2 years ago with a very innovative technology that's still on its journey to be successful, more successful. And the definition of AI, the qualifications of AI has changed dramatically over the last couple of years. And so from a GE perspective, we're very fortunate. We're proud to say that we have the largest AI portfolio in the medical device industry, which is exciting. So we have a lot of experience. We've built out an unbelievable AI team specifically because of the portfolio. And so one of the key things that I'd recommend to startups is that they really, really understand who owns the data on the back end of the AI, because data rights is critical to your value. And I think 2 years ago, 3 years ago, when lots of companies were thinking about adding AI functionality, they didn't really understand that the value of the AI was in the data that they were analyzing. So my encouragement would be to really understand who owns that data and what piece of your algorithm is running off of the data that you own, which then will return value to your opportunity.
Something else that was brought up by FDA last week was it's important to have your data collection for your submission, your market submission, but it's also, they see the value and the importance of having your data for being able to provide your future customers with what they need, your VAC committees, your market access plan. And they even said, tell us the whole story, not just what you're collecting for regulatory. Don't be afraid to share that with us. Is that also important for you to see that full story in a company's data collection plan, not just for market submission?
Yeah, really good question on that too. And I think it's important to work with quality companies such as Veranex, it's my shameless plug.
Thank you.
That can really help guide startup companies to understand how to put that whole picture together for the strategics, and really be specific on what you're trying to deliver to the strategics. Work early with the FDA, as early as you can and afford, because they will give great guidance, which will then translate to real good value when you start working with the strategics.
Thinking about that next step beyond just your market application, Eric, to you, when we worked at Medtronic a long time ago, MDD was sort of the easier CE mark. MDD was the first path for a lot of companies, and then their future expansion to the U.S. market. And I know back then Medtronic was really prioritizing, clinical data outcomes. Is your study powered effectively? How has that changed? Maybe since the 5 years we've worked together, and is market access and the plan a bit more important these days as well?
Sure. Yeah, that's an interesting question. I'll say. Still, the clinical package is core to the thesis. We're never going to look beyond that. We spent a lot of time and effort looking at that during due diligence, and I would, a plug on the venture side. If we're in your cap table, we bring a lot to the table when it comes to planning for clinical trials, running the right clinical trials. So we're great at that. That remains on the forefront. What I'll say from the M&A chair, though, is that's become table stakes. So we don't even look unless there's a really good clinical package. The things I spend more time on, and across the company, we spend more resources probably in the due diligence side, looking at things like market development. So it is some of our most difficult deals have been the ones where we had developed new markets. So we need to pay out the reimbursement. That helps, absolutely. It is very, very difficult to change physician behavior, prescribing behaviors. It is very difficult to unseat an entrenched competitor that knows you're coming. And that's where I spend so much more of my time. And as a diligence team, by far, it's how do we crack that code? The data could be great, but what are we going to do to change the physician behavior? And I'll tell you what, the deals that we've done that have dragged the most are the ones where it took a year longer, it took 2 years longer. At some point, people get tired. You start deprioritizing it. So that really clean story on how you entrench your competitors, how you're going to change physician behavior, that's core to my thesis now when I start looking at M&A deals.
And there's a lot of detail that you can get into on that. How much detail and how early are you looking for that?
Yeah, so I guess another plug on the venture side. I mean, what I would say is people in the audience looking to raise money, coming to Medtronic, I would say find the right people in the organization that are going to be the champions. Meet with them often, and when you meet with them, show them what you told them you were going to do. So you met with them 6 months ago, you said you're going to do this. When you come back 6 months, you better have done that. That builds a lot of credibility. It allows you to have that dialogue early on because we do have a lot of resources within the company. So the earlier we can engage on topics like that, course correct, give you guidance on whatever that market research might be, or that feature you might have to add, or another stakeholder you might have to include along the way. That's really important feedback. So engagement early is what we're looking for because it makes our story so much easier.
I think it's the right balance of showing how organized and how well your company can execute, but also being able to execute on that plan if you're showing some aggressive timelines. Yeah. So on that, Doug, it takes so much effort to get a meeting, to get, to a potential term sheet. What are some of the biggest pitfalls that you've seen when companies get in front of you, you have a serious discussion, and then something falls through in the diligence?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously the panelists to my right are the clinical and company specialists. So generally when I'm getting involved in something, it's sort of downstream of, we've got terrific data, we've had conversations with Virginia or Devon or Eric, and generally speaking, companies have spent a lot of time with their logical counterparts before they're ever getting to me. And I would say, the one thing that we've seen, and I would say it's particularly true today, and obviously I welcome my panelist comment because ultimately they're the companies that acquire these businesses, is that you really have to have every box checked. There's no shortcuts. You got to be properly funded. Invariably there's lots of companies that have sort of either overcapitalized or undercapitalized themselves. So it's thinking thoughtfully about how you capitalize your business and the time frame and how you spend your money. You sort of can't rush to an exit. There's just, been doing this for a really long time. I generally have a pretty good sense of the alchemy of how transactions occur. And you really need to have the right clinical and commercial champions inside of companies. And if you don't, nothing will happen, regardless of how great your data and your advisor is. If you don't have the right champions internally at these companies, you're going to be in a difficult spot.
And I'm asking honestly, not a plug for Veranex, but do having the right partners count on that, or do you really look for companies a little further along that have built the internal teams?
Yeah. Listen, I think it varies widely. I mean, we have a very big business and it's very global, and right. So if I'm working with an Israeli client, they might use a lot of external support in terms of commercialization efforts in particular. If I'm thinking about that country, right? Then you've got other companies. I mean, we're super fortunate. We're just involved with the Exonics transaction as an example that has soup to nuts, phenomenal team. End-to-end clinical, regulatory quality, really thoughtful operational outsourcing, commercial infrastructure, kind of end-to-end, built a vertically integrated business other than manufacturing, which was largely outsourced, although they brought some of that back in. So it kind of depends, depending on the company, how well it's been funded, the size of the market opportunity. I think all of those variables kind of go into the, into the equation when thinking about how it gets funded and who their partners ultimately are. But I do think, in particular, certain regions of the world, I won't say which ones, tend to be, they want to rush to an exit without really having kind of, tier one, whatever the right description you want to use, clinical data that will withstand the scrutiny of professional companies like this. And I tell them all the time, listen, if it doesn't meet my meter, it certainly won't meet, one of our clients' meters, if you're looking to get real capital.
So in other words, what I'm hearing is you really have to have all your poop in a group all around. But are there any significant areas or specific areas that you think maybe companies have fallen short or that they should focus on in particular?
Again, I think it's somewhat going to be variable depending on the company and the sector.
Yeah.
Invariably, I think to Eric's point, which I think is a really critical one, I think my experience, and again, I welcome the panelists' comments, is that most of the big companies don't like doing their own market development. My experience has been they'd actually prefer that a startup sort of builds a little bit of a market, demonstrates that the product can be commercialized, and they're happy to come in and say, okay, I've got a huge commercial infrastructure. I can now put that through my channel, but you've proven to me that this market exists, and now I'm willing to jump on it. Yep. Market development takes a lot of time and a lot of energy, and inside of big companies, whatever, in the case of Medtronic, $32 billion in sales, they rather, in my experience, is that they generally speaking would prefer to see, you sort of develop the market a little bit and then they can come in. But again, I welcome the
Yeah, let's throw that
comments.
question to the rest of you, Eric.
Yeah, I'll throw out a couple observations that I've seen where recent deals have fallen apart. You mentioned a couple of them. I'll just dive in. The size of the opportunity. A lot of times that is a function of market development. There's a lot of stakeholders that need to be aligned for your technology to be successful. You need the patient to want it. You need the physician to want it. You need the hospital to be willing to pay for it. And then you need all those people to work together. If one of those falls apart, the size of your opportunity, while it looks great, this great TAM, the reality is it's a lot smaller than that. And we struggle with that. That's a lot of times where our deals just fall apart. It's just not big enough for us. Market development, always a problem. I shouldn't have to say it, but I will. Intellectual property, always kind of first on the list. That's table stakes as well. So a couple other areas where I've seen deals go far and then we just can't get there because we're just not comfortable enough with the opportunity, or it's going to take too long. Not to say we say no with those instances. There's times we've come back and said, look, take some more of our money. There's going to be some strings attached, like a call option or something on the back, but you guys do some more of the heavy lifting. Let this market evolve. You guys will be better at it, and then we'll come on later on. So those are all things I've seen.
Yeah, the only one when you didn't mention, which I thought of as you were just talking about, that is reimbursement. Demonstrating that you can actually get paid for your product, and particularly if it's even better, really profitable for whether it's an ASC or a hospital system. It's a little bit of a dirty word to say that people like to make money, but the reality is, you got to be able to get paid for the product. And I would say that is a mistake I see often, where they don't think early enough on, how am I actually going to get reimbursed and paid for this product?
I would add on to that. I think reimbursement is key. We have used a third-party company such as Veranex to help us analyze opportunities to make sure that the pathway to reimbursement is possible. So for all of you that don't have reimbursement plans yet, it's okay. Have a pathway. Work with good qualified partners like Veranex to help verify that pathway so that when we go into due diligence, it's all lined up, it's logical, and it makes sense, because that is absolutely critical. It's a good point.
Yeah, I guess, what was the original question that we were answering here? About
how deals fall apart.
How deals? Oh, yes, and market development. So I was gonna speak to that, because Edwards is maybe a little bit different because we're so deep in one area. We tend to like to go in very early within the structural heart space and really shape that market. So we built the TAVR market. So we're not. That might be even like our preferred sort of getting in early and shaping the field. And so then from that perspective, what we're more concerned about is sort of missteps by a company early on in the reimbursement or the pricing or those kinds of areas, regulatory space, where we feel like that strategy would not be consistent with how we would think about it. So that's where we like to get in early. And for us to make sure everything moves along smoothly to a transaction, which of course it doesn't always, but we really like to get in there and build relationships with startup companies very early on. And, with the companies that come to me, and usually when companies are reaching out to strategics, it's to say hey, we want an investment. So they come to us for our money, right? But I think, and I'm not going to diminish the impact of money, because money is absolutely important when you're sitting there trying to fund a company. But I will say this, that many times the the startups walk away from us with strategic input that's a lot more valuable in the long run than the money. And so, for those of you in the audience who are, frustrated in like, hey, you're raising and you come and you talk to us and like, you don't like the sort of discussion goes on and like, let's have a follow-up and, meeting, and maybe we don't invest in that round. I'd say I've seen this play out many times where these relationships are built over a year, over many years, and then ultimately can result in an exit to a strategic. So it's sort of like, be patient. It's usually the answer is it's not no, it's not now. And to the question of where I've seen this fall apart is another aspect that's really important is just listen, we're all in med tech and we don't know the answer. And so there's risks there, like things will go wrong. And in fact, when I talk to startups and I ask them that, so what's going wrong and how do you solve it? And they say, oh, nothing's going wrong. Then I'm really suspicious. So I think a key aspect of when I've seen things fall through, and it's like relationships not progressing, usually it's often not about the technology. It comes down to the humility of the team that you're working with. So being able to be humble and transparent and and be able to speak to what you know, what you don't know, and when there are challenges, just being very upfront about that.
That brings up an interesting question, too, of timing, like in dating before you get married and before you ink that partnership. How important is just timing with how often strategic priorities change, leadership changes, how much does just right time, right place, being at the right spot in your development play into it? I guess to everyone.
Absolutely critical, no question. Timing's everything, just like dating. And so this is speed dating, and the more often you do it, the better you get at it. And so I think the recommendation is to engage with the strategic that aligns with what you're solving. Don't try to go to somebody that's in a urology business and you have a neurosurgery product. Even though it has some of the same words, it's not going to work. So you really have to understand what that strategic company is and what their vision is and what their leadership, to Kristi, your point, if they come in new, what their 3 to 5 year plan is. Because as an example, when GE Healthcare spun off, it was a wonderful opportunity from GE going from this huge conglomerate to a very specific, focused healthcare mission. And it's been a fantastic ride over the last 12 months, but that's very different than who GE was 2 years ago. And so our focus and our priorities have changed dramatically. And so for the startups that have been engaged in dating GE for a while, get to know who the new leaders are and really what our focus is for the next 3 to 5 years.
Yeah, I'd say from Medtronic's perspective, I'd like to not say for Medtronic for the right asset, timing, at least within Medtronic, is typically not a problem. The reality is we've got 20-ish businesses, billion-ish plus per business. There's a lot of mouths to feed and not enough dollars to go around to do all the deals that everybody wants to do. So there is a timing element that it's just the reality of it. There's also, we've got a budget cycle, and sometimes, the team you want to sell to, they're working on their budget, they're working on their strategic plan. So there are elements like that just to be cognizant of. But yes, build those relationships with those operating units, understand what they're going through, what their challenges are, as best you can, time what it is you need to get done to coincide when you think you're going to get most of their attention.
Eric, when I hear that, I think having all of your affairs in order is even more important, because if the timing strikes, a strategic priority shifts, and you're going to then engage in diligence in a company, we often see as a consulting business, companies say, we're going to worry about reimbursement later. We're going to worry about our quality management system. We don't have our design history files in place. We'll worry about design control later. And it's often an uphill battle for us to educate companies, especially looking to potentially get acquired or have a strategic partner like those of you on stage, it's always like, we'll worry about it later. Regulatory is the most important thing. So isn't timing being so crucial kind of more of importance to have all of those affairs in order?
I'll speak from my experiences on the startup side, on the one successful transaction in particular. There were many nights we spent all-nighters getting our QMS system in place before due diligence, and that's not the right way to do it. So to your point,
But it's so
that's
true.
what
It's
happens.
the reality. Yes.
So to your point, work with quality partners, third-party companies, such as Veranex, that can help you get your ducks in a row so that when it is time, you've done all this wonderful work, focused on a great product, you're solving a really important problem, but a large strategic is not going to be interested in a risk because your QMS system isn't in place. So I think that's really important.
Also,
Yeah, I mean, I think like just the logistics of it being like sort of data room ready. If you are looking for a strategic investment or for an exit, you know, just having all your docs in order is critical to put them. I mean, we probably all ask for just about the same thing. And if you're under design control, it's like, where are you in the process and what documents support it? But for Edwards, you know, the timing piece on our side, that isn't super critical. I mean, you need to, we're sort of more of a mid-sized company in comparison to Medtronic. But, you know, so it's like, how could we absorb an acquisition? So we have to consider that. But if it's an early stage investment, the most critical thing is it on strategy for us? So that's where having the dialogue with us and understand, you know, what your technology is, and we can pretty quickly get to, do we think it could be on strategy? And if it's close, then it's getting down and knowing like the particulars of, okay, what's your clinical plan, the population you're serving, and all of that.
go ahead.
Yeah, I'll just add to that because it's interesting. You mentioned due diligence. Maybe Medtronic's due diligence list isn't the right one, but I think you should really take advantage of, you know, third parties like Veranex. Understand what that due diligence list is coming your way and have a plan for every one of those tabs. And there's multiple of them, but have a plan for them. And then use your boards and use your successful peers that have gone through that to understand the best plan of attack. But don't wait until you've talked to Doug and say, all right, now what do I need to go figure out? It's probably too late. So, you know, use third parties that, again, the due diligence lists are thorough, but they're out there, and you know at least what you need to plan for.
Yeah, listen, I mean, just on the topic of timing, obviously, is an interesting one. I mean, I think it's sort of like trying to time the stock market. It's close to impossible, right? And so I think, you know, I think all the panelists made some really good points, but I think you need to have credibility and you have to have consistency, right? And I'd say very few deals happen overnight and they don't happen in a vacuum, right? And so you really have to have a lot of credibility. And so to Eric's point, I'll ask clients, hey, can you send me the last deck you sent this client 2 years ago? And I'll look at what the numbers look like now. And if they're dramatically different, I'll ask, when did you last present these? And then I know we're going to have a problem if the numbers are dramatically off relative to where they were, right? And so it's little things like that that actually matter a great deal. It also applies to clinical and other areas, right? And so to me, timing is a consequence of so many factors, where a company is strategically, where they are financially, et cetera. But if it's on the strategic roadmap, they'll eventually get to you if it makes sense. But you have to have credibility along the way. And it's important to not sort of pretend that you're something that you're not. You're better off just being humble, I think was the word Devon used, about where you actually are and when you intend to be. Because I think when you come back a year later or 2 years later, because these things tend to take time, to have just demonstrated, hey, we've hit all the milestones that we told you we were going to hit.
Yeah, and I'd like to build on this because that's something absolutely we look at, and we tend to remember it. Even if we don't pull up the old deck, we tend to remember what's been told to us in terms of timeline and all the numbers. But another aspect of that is that we'll often have very specific questions. You know, how are you planning to address this population or whatever? And we really want to see that when companies come back to us in 3-6 months, that they've heard our question and they come back with an answer to it or a plan for how they would answer it in the future. And that's sort of interesting to see how companies react. And it really is much more impressive when a company comes back and said, hey, you asked me about this the last time we met, and I followed up, and this is the research. I had a company that did this to me a couple of weeks ago where I was asking about the aspects of the market assessment, and they came back and they went through, like, they'd gone out and gotten a lot of consumer data to specifically address the question I had posed, like it was probably almost a year ago. And that, that makes an impression. That really shows follow through.
And the start of a partnership, really.
I'm a sort of partnership.
Yeah.
And, we're all in this journey of how we bring better products to patients. We're in that together. And things like that, where you pose a question like, I didn't know the answer to it, but when she went off and looked into it and came back to me with the answer, like, we're learning together, right? And we're learning together with this purpose of how can we bring better products out to the patient.
You're not
So
like
we
asking to
Right.
to catch them
Right.
and with their pants
Right.
down. Yeah. Terrible analogy. But with the time that we have left, I just kind of want to ask each of you, what is your outlook on M&A and strategic partnerships for this coming year? Interest rates are still high. There's reports looking at certain markets that may be hotter for M&A. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I have a good friend in our BD department that likes to say, Devon, cash and courage are powerful. And so right now the strategics probably are a little bit more cash heavy than some of the private equity folks that are trying to make safer bets. So I think we, looking from a GE standpoint, are in a very positive outlook. We definitely believe in a good balance between inorganic and organic growth. So we're very excited about the future, especially since the spinoff has really allowed us to focus specifically on healthcare.
So just to double tap on that, so you're looking to expand your current revenue streams, but also open to bringing in new revenue streams.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. There you go. Meet with Devon this week.
Yes. I don't have the checkbook, but I'm happy to meet with you. Yes.
How about you,
I think it's
Virginia?
always fun at like the end of the year, or the beginning of the next year, to look at the numbers and see like what really happened. What does it look like? And but I think there's sort of an inevitability of it to maintain the kind of growth that we have across these companies, that it's got to be a combination of organic and inorganic. And so if you're going to get there inorganically, then there have to be acquisitions along the way. So I'm pretty positive.
Positive as
I'm
well. All right.
positive in my crystal ball.
We have 2 of 4. Eric, are you going to bring down the
Yeah,
heat?
look, I'd like to be as positive as you too. But when I talk to people, I think there's a ton of opportunity. When I think about this, last year was just a bit of a mess, right? You had what should have been pretty easy demand because you're coming out of COVID, but then you had supply chain issues that probably dampened that demand, and then you had inflation that made your margins go haywire, and then you had higher interest rates that made your EPS go crazy. So I think there's a lot of consolidators in our industry that are just trying to right-size the ship for 2024. They need to show the street that they could grow and they can grow profitably, so they need to show some leverage. If you need to show leverage, then are you going to do a lot of super dilutive deals? Not to say you're not going to do deals. I think you're probably then going to be looking at, all right, how do we kick the can down the road further? And in some of the environment for the companies, that's probably not a bad idea, right? It's a little bit less dilutive financing. There's some strings attached, but there's an opportunity for you to get to an exit. On the flip side, I think if you've got revenue and you've got a really clean path to profitability, I think all day long those companies are interesting. So I think there's opportunities there. I think if you've got the right asset in the right segment, that could go very early. Those opportunities are there. There's just not quite as many as those. But beyond that, I mean, the cash is available. I think there's going to be a balance between showing the street that for our Medtronic, and in particular, we've got a great pipeline. But every dollar that we we want to spend, we've got to either trade it for an M&A deal or invest it, in structural heart or in the robot or something else. So there's a very difficult conversation when we're making those trade-offs. So I think that's going to balance, at least from our perspective, kind of how the deals materialize. I think they'll be there, but they're not going to be maybe as straightforward as they were in the past.
I think what a lot of companies would love to hear too is, your channels being something that they're looking for and maybe a strategic partnership, but you're saying revenue is important to show. So when companies are looking to and exit a little bit sooner and don't have their own channels, that's something that a strategic partnership would be ideal. In terms of, M&A activity versus partnerships, is there any advice that you could give, the startups in the room as to how much they should be preparing for driving their own revenue or coming to Medtronic for your channels?
It just depends. We have a great channel, and we're very happy to use that in the right instance.
Yeah.
And we've done that. We've shown that. We've talked about it. So in some instances, it's a win-win, right? I know the companies would like to see an earlier exit. If it's go raise, $100 million and develop a channel, or take less from us, use our channel, but, maybe you're not getting that 10x return you were hoping for. I think that's a potentially win-win for everyone. But it's very much deal dependent.
Mm-hmm.
We'll stretch. It just depends on what it is. But I do want to hear what
Yeah.
Doug correct us all and tell us what's really going to happen.
Listen, I'll start macro and then I'll go micro, right? The macro is, and I've been doing this a lot of years, the macro is none of us probably in this entire room have lived through a high interest rate, high inflation cycle in the United States in our adult careers, okay? So let's start with that as a basic premise. And I think it's probably a bold but fair statement, right? And so I think the last couple of years, people have gotten addicted to interest rates. And all you have to do is look at the housing market and how it's kind of stopped because nobody wants to trade out of a 3% mortgage to a 7% mortgage. Well, if you applied that to a corporate mindset, companies that a few years ago money was free, literally, and actually holding cash cost you money because you couldn't earn any money on it. Now cash, you can earn 5% in 2-year treasuries, and your cost of capital to raise money a few years ago for any of the companies next to me might have been 2-3%, is now 5 to 7%, depending on the deal. So cost of capital has become a real issue, but obviously now interest rates are at least somewhat coming down. We'll see what happens with short-term rates. The Fed keeps kicking the can down the road. So we're in the right direction. And I would say, a question I get a lot from companies, particularly earlier stage companies, hey, there's been no IPO market. How come more companies aren't getting acquired? And especially with large corporates who are awash in capital and have a lot of money to spend, but corporate balance sheets are in phenomenal shape. So you've got all the right makings for activity, but I would say, a lot of the things that Eric mentioned, and I'd say other companies, they're very particular, right? I mean, they want what they want. Again, recent experience has been they're willing to pay more for the things that they really want that are accretive to growth. And as companies get bigger, Edwards is the smallest company, probably has an $80 billion market cap now or thereabouts. These are big companies, right? And so they need big ideas and large things that can move the needle inside of a large revenue base, right? And so, I found over the last couple of years, I've been very particular about what they want, and they'd rather, again, in many cases, rather, maybe with the exception I think Virginia made earlier, which is a good one, about sort of like we're a little bit more of a market development company, which is a very obviously fair statement. They want to see revenue generating companies, ideally companies that actually generate profits, which I know is relatively novel for earlier stage companies in our industry. And, so I think the alchemy is all there, but I think there's a ton of appetite. We're very busy on a lot of different things, but it's just been exceedingly difficult to get transactions done for a zillion idiosyncratic reasons, which I would bore the entire audience with. But I do think there's a lot of things going on underneath the covers that hasn't necessarily made the headlines yet.
With the heavy lift of EUMDR, any thoughts on fire sales in Europe or divestiture or divesting of products that companies just don't want to do the heavy lift?
I haven't seen that.
No, I'd say it knocks valuation down a little bit if that's an important revenue stream. And it's also, for us, it was an opportunity to get a little bit, companies in the past would get the CE mark, they get a couple hundred patients. It just gives you more confidence in the clinical. You don't get that now. it's probably going to impact valuation, is my gut.
Well, I see we have a blinking red light here. We're out of time, but thank you so much it's so nice to be on stage with some friends and new friends, and I hope everyone enjoyed this panel. Thank you.